Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming this morning. We've had a very busy week, so nice to see some people again here this morning. So today we have Mark Pickering, who's going to talk about open and more accessible microscope access to, and focusing on the marine.
Yeah, and microplastics.
And microplastics. So this is our leading member from the School of Medicine. So I'll hand over to Mark to say a little bit about his work.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Right, is this working? Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't need that one. I don't need that one. Okay. So I'm Mark. I build microscopes. I'm going to come on to that in a moment. But before I talk about that, I'm just going to go back in time a little bit. I'm going to go back to. Oh. This. There we go. 1976. So 1976 was a very important year for lots of different reasons. There's two things that happened in 1976 that I want to focus in on. The first of those is that just across the Irish Sea in London in October, the Sex Pistols recorded Anarchy in the UK, which was their first single and the first kind of groundbreaking kind of song that kind of really kicked off the punk movement in the UK. And this side of the Irish Sea, the other thing that happened, literally within a matter of days, it's just up the road in Dublin, a child was born. A child who stands before you today. Now, is that a coincidence? Yeah, obviously, right? But it's a nice way for me to insert myself into the story. Right, I said I build microscopes, so why am I talking about punk music at all? Punk music, let's just ignore that for the moment, what the music is. Why did it happen in 1976 when it happened? So we go a little bit further back. What did music look like just before punk? And then one of the dominant things in kind of rock music was prog rock. And prog rock was big and it was complicated, right? So, you know, suddenly guitars sprung extra necks, right? And we had these new fangled synths that were appearing in bands that basically required, you know, a master's degree in engineering just to operate. And I mean, I don't even know what this is, right? It had become big, it had become complicated. And it was only very specialized. This is not the sort of thing anybody could just do themselves, right? This was a very specialized, complicated type of music. This excluded a huge number of people who would have wanted to actually create music. And one of the things that happened when punk happened was people took music and stripped it back to basics. You didn't need a lot of music theory. You didn't need a lot of skill. You didn't need a lot of equipment. You just needed a space, some people to play with, and then strip everything back. The point here is you take something complicated and it becomes so complicated nobody can access it. You then strip it back to its fundamentals. And now it's something that everybody can do if they want to. So hopefully you see where I'm going with this. Microscopes, right? How does this apply to microscopes? Well, like, what is a microscope? What does a microscope look like? Some of you may be, you know, microscope users. You might be very familiar with this. Some of you might not be, right? And if we think about what a microscope looks like in terms of like the general perception, one of the best things to do is just put in a Google image search, right? And if you put in a Google image search for microscope, you come up with something like this, which most people would recognize as a microscope. Another thing is you can just look at stock photography. Here's like 4 classic pieces of stock photography that I found. And one of the things I could spend a long time talking about what's wrong with these photos. But one of the things that you'll notice is you get the same microscopes over and over, right? So that's the same microscope as that. And here's another one that you see in a lot of them. This microscope, if anyone's interested, you can just go down the road. You can buy this at Smith's. So this is a toy microscope. This is a child's microscope. This is what it's built for. And actually the other microscope, little more expensive. You got to go to AliExpress for that one. You can get that there. You know, again, like you can see, this is marketed to children, right? If you look at the sort of mishmash of search terms that they put into the item description. My favorite one in this, by the way, is, you know, HD experiment photography, junior children's science, sperm, right? So, you know, you need to make sure you capture that cohort of people who are searching for sperm on AliExpress for some reason. My other favorite thing about this, I'm very embarrassed to say this, especially, you know, she's kind of, you know, pointed out that I'm the representative of the School of Medicine. This microscope also appears in the promotional material that our school uses to advertise their research, which is incredibly embarrassing. But as the only School of Medicine person here, I'm going to get away with saying that. Anyway, right. So that's what people think microscopes look like. But what's the reality of modern research microscopes? And they look something like this, right? So this is the sort of custom engineered piece of equipment. This is the sort of commercial things that people are using now. We are in the prog rock era of microscopy, right? It is big, it is complicated, it is expensive. These things are capable of incredible things, right? But with that power comes an incredible cost. The cost of these things, you can't buy these things in Smith's for 50 euros. Right? These cost hundreds of thousands of euros, right? And require very specialized skill in order to operate. So what's puncture microscopy? What if we apply the same principles? What if we strip back to basic principles and make something that is easier and more accessible? And that's kind of what we do, right? This is the sort of imaging things that we make, right? Things out of just tripods and cameras and boxes and, you know, microscopes just attached to, you know, using coffee stirrers as slide holders and things like that. This is just a microscope that I built just on my desk because I missed the bus one day and had some pieces lying around. It's easy because we strip it back to basics. A really important thing I want to make from the outset. I have no idea what I'm doing most of the time. I am not an expert. I am not an engineer. I'm not a physicist. I'm a lowly biologist, right? And if I can make microscopes, anybody can. If you take nothing away from what I'm going to say, take that away. Now, so how did I get to this? So I kind of need to bring you into a little bit of a love story here. And that's a love story between me and this little fella. This is the animal that I do most of my research on and have done for quite a few years. This is Pleurobrachia pileus. It's a tiny marine invertebrate. It's comb jelly. They're incredibly charismatic. They're fantastic to look at. I could spend all day talking about what we do with them, and I'm not going to bother, right? The short summary of this, we were interested in how their nervous system works. The point is, not many people work with these animals, right? So the tools to actually do research on these animals aren't readily available. So we kind of have to invent what we need. And when we started working on these, we knew we needed a microscope, and I had a little bit of money to buy a microscope. But I didn't know some even basic things. So even really simple terms, do we need an inverted microscope or an upright microscope? So in a fit of hubris, I kind of thought, like, why can't we have both? Why can't we have a microscope that does both, right? Why can't we have a microscope that we can turn from one to the other? There wasn't one available on the market, so I kind of thought, well, I bet I could build one. Having no experience whatsoever, right? And no real idea what I was doing. But I discovered that you could do this. And we basically found that you can buy just basic optical components, plug them together, and we came up with this. And this is the flexiscope, because it's a microscope and it's flexible. And this is essentially, you'll see, we're not very good at naming our instruments. We're better at building them than naming them. It's still kind of complicated, but it's sort of the ace up its sleeve is that you can flip it around and turn it from an inverted microscope to an upright microscope. And so, yeah, that's what it does. And does it work? Yes, it can do fluorescence imaging. It can do the sort of standard fluorescence imaging that the commercial systems can do. And it can also has a few other little extra tricks up its sleeve. So you can do, this is some imaging inside an animal, structures and movement inside a live animal. And its most useful thing, because we're really lazy, right, is that it can automatically scan an entire sample, right? So we put a sample under the microscope and it will automatically scan over the entire thing and create these enormous high resolution montages of our entire samples. To do this, so yes, this is what we made and we published this. And if anyone wants to, you can just go and download the build instructions and it tells you step by step what to make. And this cost 17,000 euros, which is cheap for a microscope, right? It is like a fraction of the cost of the commercial systems, and it's effectively multiple commercial systems in one. But the most expensive component, I was impressed with myself, right? But I was like, I like the fact that it's cheap, but wouldn't it be nice if it was cheaper? And the most expensive component on this was the automation, right? The bit that moved the sample around. And that used these piezo steppers. And one of the things that we do a lot of is 3D printing. And 3D printing uses basic stepper motors and very simple control systems, and it's cheap. So we basically retrofitted it with steppers, and we dropped the price significantly. So this started an obsession. How cheap can we make these things? So the next thing we developed then was a microscope which was designed to actually fit in an incubator and scan cells. And we took the inspiration from a 3D printer. We took it a bit further, and we basically got a cheap 3D printer, tore it apart for its parts, and reassembled it as a microscope. This is what it looks like. It sits into an incubator. You can just leave it there and it will continuously monitor cells. So here you can scan an entire plate of cells and you can see cellular resolution. And again, you can just find the build instructions for this, and anybody can reproduce this. And we've come down by an order of magnitude in cost. So this you can probably build for about €2,000. So significantly cheaper. So what's the point of all of this, right? Yeah, why bother with this? Yes, it's nice that these things are cheap and that makes them accessible and we don't have to spend so much money on that. We can spend it on other things. But the really important thing is that once we learned how to do this, we can design whatever tool we want for whatever question we want, right? Because we're not restricted by what's available commercially or what's available in a core facility. We can just make what we want as we need it. We can pick our tool to match our problem. I'll give you another example of this. One of the things that we wanted to do with our animals was image their structure in 3D. So we came up with this system to image the live animals with a light sheet. And here you can see sections through the live animal. And then we come up with another way of imaging fixed animals. So we can basically do optical projection tomography, which is basically like CT, but with light instead of X-rays. And that gives us these nice 3D reconstructions. And again, this is really important. This is how we did this, right? This is that silly looking thing that we saw earlier. That gave us that light sheet thing. We've got this other system that lets us do this 3D imaging. And this is great because this let us, publish some data on the structure of these animals. It also let us kind of create 3D models of them so we can model the behavior of kind of essentially phantoms of these animals in our aquarium systems. And most importantly, it let us 3D print little Christmas lights that are kind of shaped like tennis, which is quite nice to be able to do. And that's lovely, right? But the next problem, so how can we take that approach and apply it to the next problem? The next problem we became interested in actually came about from working with these animals. And what you see, and here's another one of our, I do like these animals. There's lots of videos of them. One of the things that you'll see, we got this nice little trick for actually seeing the sort of cilia moving on the animals, but what you'll see is lots of stuff all around them. And we're taking these out of the sea, and what we discovered, like a lot of this is microplastics. And we discovered that, these animals, you can see there's lots of microplastic particles around this, and they're interacting with the animals. And we find lots of plastic particles in our samples when we take them out of the sea, in the water. And we do have another project which is actually looking at how microplastic particles affect these animals. But what this really got us interested in is like how much microplastics is actually in the ocean. And when we started looking at this, it became obvious that this is a really big and a really important question. And we don't really have the tools to answer this. There's lots of ways to measure microplastics. And one of them is, lots of them are imaging based or microscopy based, but they typically require quite expensive imaging tools. So you can just take a water sample, you can filter it, stick it under a microscope, and measure microplastics. There's various ways of doing that. But either the equipment required is expensive or the skills required are difficult. So this isn't something that you can do everywhere in the world. And this is a global problem. So we need some way of measuring microplastics that we can scale globally. And this is where, so Neve, who's sitting over there, this is kind of her baby. We wanted to basically build as cheap and accessible and easy to use and easy to reproduce microscope as possible. We kind of took our inspiration from our earlier things of using 3D printers. In this case, we got the cheapest, most ubiquitous 3D printer we could find, which is an Ender 3, and literally bolted a microscope onto it. So left the 3D printer intact, didn't disassemble it for parts, just bolted the microscope on. And we call this the Enderscope, which I hate the name of it, but it's stuck now. And this will scan over an entire piece of filter paper and detect all of the microplastics over the whole thing. But the really interesting thing about this is this was designed specifically to be simple. We simplified everything down and made everything, the entire thing can be built from stuff you can buy on Amazon. So this is a close-up of the latest version of it. Rather than using expensive research objectives, we use the cheapest sort of generic objectives. And again, this is like €10 from Amazon. We use very, very simple, cheap cameras. The lighting system is just a simple LED ring. For fluorescence, because capable of fluorescence, for fluorescence filters, we just use lighting gels, the sort of stuff that's used just in photography. And the whole thing works. And the most important thing about it, my favorite thing about it, is you don't lose your 3D printer if you have this, because the entire microscope assembly just clips off, and then you can just reattach the printer head, right? So if you get one of these, if you have one of these, the cost of the 3D printer isn't lost. You still have a 3D printer. It's just the cost. And most of the parts of this are actually printable on the 3D printer. So it's essentially self-replicating to an extent. And that's an earlier prototype, and this is the final version of it, which is, you know, capable of scanning over and detecting microplastics. This is completely open, right? The entire thing's on GitHub, and anybody can take this, build their own, construct their own, modify it, make their own version of it. We have versions of this currently, since we sort of put this on GitHub last summer. We have a version in Scotland, a version in France, a version in the Netherlands that we know of. So this is already kind of spreading out across the world. But the most important, so it's going out to other researchers. Other researchers are building this, but that's not, I think, the target audience here, because what we want is something that everybody can use. And we think people can use this. We think it's accessible. We think non-experts will be able to build and use this thing. But to find out, what we're going to do is give it to people, right? So we've had a kind of a long history of kind of working with different kind of community organizations and doing sort of various kind of public engagement work. And this puts us in contact with, you know, like every year we do Dublin Maker, and there's 10,000 people like in a field, and they come along and they're interested in technology and things like this, and they want to have a go. And what we're doing is we've got the funding now to just give away 10 to start with, right? So we've got 10 of these that we can just build and just give to anybody who wants it. Schools, community groups, maker spaces, and we're going to give them out to people and just ask them to tell us what works, what doesn't work. So next week, in the next couple of weeks, the paper will be published. It's accepted. It's just about to be published. But this project isn't over. This is going to continue on, and we're going to continue to refine this in collaboration with the public. Because I think this is the really important point about this. It's not just about making the tools for the problems that you have. It's that the approach that we have of making very complicated things creates problems. When we have these big steps in technology, they come with big steps in cost. And every time we do that, we exclude a whole bunch of the world from these tools. We think that this type of approach, this making things simple, accessible, but still usable and functional, will get these things out to the world and let people kind of, and it's suitable for global problems like microplastic pollution. We're not the only ones doing this, right? There are other people doing this much better than us. My favorite is the Open Flexure project. And this is a microscope which is almost entirely 3D printed. And they have been they've spread this all around the world. And they've been using this for specific problems. So the latest one that they're working with, so this is Joe Napper from the Open Flexure group. And this is him in Rwanda, working with clinicians there, using this for pathology. So for cancer diagnostics. Simple, cheap, accessible equipment. But it's not just about research. So we target these things to specific problems. I think that's interesting. But actually, what I think is really powerful about this approach is the fact that anybody can do this. I remind you, I'm basically an idiot, right? And if I can do this, anybody can. But people don't realize how easy these things are. And what if we just give everybody, we let everybody access these tools and let everybody play and let everybody discover? And like, I showed you the sort of things that we build, like it's easy. Like the point of all this is easy. I can just throw this is a functioning microscope that I just built out of bits on my desk. I showed you earlier this really nice kind of way we have of imaging these animals. We did this with an LED light we got from IKEA, a beaker, and a couple of polarizers that we bought from a photography shop. And that lets you just see things you can't otherwise see. It's not complicated. Anybody can do this. Simple tools lets people see the world in ways that they haven't seen them before. And we even let scientists do this. So just a couple of weeks ago, Niamh organized this workshop. We actually had people over from the Open Flexure group, and we had people building their own microscopes, primarily out of Lego. So you can take some Lego pieces, you can build a functioning microscope, and you can even use the little Lego figures to become the focusing mechanism. This is easy, and my kind of vision is that everybody gets to do this. And just to kind of explain how simple this is a really nice fluorescent image of fluorescent dyes on a piece of apple, and that was my 4-year-old daughter who did this. This should be accessible to everybody. Right, so just to finish up, just to kind of introduce the people who actually did the work, so the rest of the band. So Amy Courtney and George Mercers were the previous PhD students who did the Incubot and the Flexiscope. Niamh and Amy are my current students. And when one of your PhD students has a side gig as a children's TV presenter, you just can't resist the temptation to use that picture when you're showing her off. Thank you very much, folks.